we're going to talk about all things late summer into the fall, and we'll also cover some plants as well, which is really the fun part. So a little bit, just a disclaimer, I work with CSU and we're an equal opportunity access and non-discrimination university. As Ben mentioned, I have sent my slides and you will receive the slides, the full slide deck in the email that you get tomorrow. So don't feel like you need to take frantic notes. You'll also get the recording so you could obviously pause things and take screenshots. So you'll get that. And if there's anything else I can do to accommodate your needs, please just let me know. I also work for Extension, and I realize that that's kind of a term that you may not have heard of before. We are the outreach arm of Colorado State University. And so I work on behalf of the university in my local county, which is Larimer. For those who are from Golden, you're in Jefferson County. And we're really where the university meets the community. So we have all of this incredible research, this incredible information from the university, and we in Extension bring it back to you at the community level in a way that you can use it in your everyday life. So I specialize in horticulture. I have too many degrees in horticulture to name, but just know that we are available to you. We know that gardening in Colorado can be really difficult, and we hope to help make that easier. So I also coordinate the Master Gardener program. We have Master Gardeners up and down the Front Range and throughout the state. So definitely reach out to us if you're struggling with anything. And my email address is in the slides. It will also be at the very end. And so again, if we don't get to your question tonight, don't hesitate to reach out. I would be happy to help you. What we'll discuss tonight are the following topics. So what is a perennial? We'll touch on design. I'm not a landscape designer. I don't pretend to be. There are people who are very skilled in this area. We'll talk a little bit about planting, maintaining, and then we'll go into some great perennials. And tonight I really tried to focus on those perennials that have done well this season because it has been hot. It has been dry up until recently, and it's just been really difficult. So I've been very impressed with a few select perennials that I'll introduce to you a little bit later. Starting things off, we do have to talk about what a perennial is, and these are really almost the unsung heroes of the landscape. Our vegetables are a lot of flash. Our annual flowers like petunias and geraniums get a lot of attention, especially during the summer months, but our perennials are those reliable plants that are herbaceous, and so they don't tend to have woody stems, and they come back year after year after year. Perennials are wonderful because they tend to have a fairly long season of bloom. They're mostly low maintenance, and there's a lot of diversity with our perennials. You can get a lot of bang for your buck when you invest in perennials. The nice thing too, I'm a budget shopper, probably like many of you, and unlike some trees and shrubs, which come in maybe larger size containers, you can get smaller sized perennial pots. And in time, those will grow up and catch up to the bigger sized plants. But it is a more economical way to add some color, pollinator friendly pizzazz to your landscape. So the plants usually die back to the ground every year and then they'll regrow from the crown. A couple common perennials, and we'll meet some of these later today: coneflower, sedums, iris, hosta. These are all really common perennials that you might encounter or have grown in previous landscapes. So the benefits of perennials, I touched on a few, but really it's a plant once and enjoy for years. Now there are some perennials, and we call them short-lived, where they may not live for decades in the landscape, but a lot of these often reseed. And so we'll still get pockets of these perennials. They do have a longer bloom period, so we're looking at least a month. Sometimes when we cut them back, you might get a second period of bloom, which is really a nice benefit. Lots of different textures, colors, shapes, sizes, heights, which is really important. And so a lot of times we always think to our woody plants to take up more space. But you know, if you're looking for something that's 5 feet tall, there might be ornamental grasses that can fit that bill. So really a lot of difference. And in terms of what does well in Colorado, we have a huge selection of Waterwise perennials that do well. Some are native, some are introduced, but we really do have a really good diversity of plants that we can use in our landscapes. When it comes to design, the biggest thing that you want to consider, and the biggest mistake that I think sometimes we do, myself included, you don't want to just plunk. So you don't want to go to the garden center and then be wooed by everything that's wonderful. So maybe you're going to be going to the garden center over the next few weeks, and they're going to have sales. Sales mean deals, and deals mean that you are going to probably buy more than what you had anticipated buying. Uh, when we're buying plants, we do want to have a purpose for that plant in mind. I think we've all made that mistake of you bought something maybe on a whim, maybe it's a house plant, and then you're like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with this? Where am I going to plant it? I'm not sure where it's going to go. So really try to be intentional as best you can with your plant choices. Also think about hydrozoning. That's just a fancy word for planting like plants with like water needs together. That's a big thing. So in this case, we don't want to mix our tomatoes with our native drought tolerant perennials. That's not good, right? Because we'll overwater one and underwater the other, and neither are going to be happy. So hydrozoning is really, really important in planting like water needs together. Perennials are great because they can mix with trees and shrubs. So you could have a really nice shrub kind of as an accent plant. You could have some perennials below it coming forward. So they mix well. Plus, a lot of our perennials are often ground covers too, so they can take up that surface area. And a lot of perennials will also naturalize, which is spreading. They might do this by underground root structures, or they might do this by seed. And we may have made the mistake of planting some things and given them too much water, and they've kind of taken over a space. So do be cautious when you're buying things and look for those keywords that might say aggressive or spreads easily. You might not want to introduce those to your landscape just because you might have to do some control options later, but they can fill in gaps, and that's a really nice benefit. When you're looking at plants, and this is part of the design process, is you're going to consider different colors and textures. So consider what's in your landscape. Now, when I first moved into my house, I live in Windsor, I apparently had an obsession with everything yellow. Every single plant I put in the front lawn or the front landscape area was yellow. Not sure why. It looked fine, but it was really kind of one note. So really look at those different colors. So you might have some heuchera, which is featured here, which has more of that dark chocolate colored foliage. You could also pair that with a lime green heuchera, the coral bells, and pair those together. Just know that when you're looking at colors, the darker colors tend to recede. You don't see them as obvious than the lighter colors. So things with silver foliage or white flowers or yellow flowers will really pop, while the darker textures and colors are going to be less noticeable. When you plant bright colors next to dark colors, that's when you get that amazing color combination. And it's kind of like the perfect storm of everything. So just think of our popular color combinations like white and navy or black and white. You know, we have a dark, we have a light, and together they really accent and complement each other. So when it comes to our landscapes, there's no set way of doing things and there's no set way of designing, but just know that there is beauty created through contrast. So those contrasting colors and textures can make your landscape a lot more interesting. Just a couple photos. So here we have some black-eyed Susan, which is in the front. We have what looks to be like a salvia, that lower growing kind of silvery one. Then we have some coneflower and then the Shasta daisy. So we have kind of very similar flower structures. So the flowers look similar, but we have different contrasting colors. So just an example of what you can do. Here we have a mixture of coral bells. I love coral bells. They are amazing. They have so many different interesting foliage colors that you could really have a nice garden of just different colored textures of all the same plant species. That would be a great option. Then we also want to consider texture. So texture is the thing that You notice when everything again is more one note. So if we have all the yellow flowers planted, you're like, wow, a lot of yellow. But if you have everything that's the same leaf size or leaf shape, it gets to be a little monotonous as well. And that might be what you love, and that's totally fine. But really, if you can think about texture of the plant and place different textures of plants together, it's really going to enhance the garden. So larger leaf plants next to small leaf plants, fleshy leaf next to ferny or lacy. These are things that you can think about. And one of the best tips I ever got was the recommendation to take a black and white photo of your garden and then look for those contrasting textures. So here we have two plants. On the right, we have columbine, really common plant for us. And then on the left, we have brunnera, which is more of a ground cover. And you can see how cool a variegation the brunnera has. But with your phone, your smartphone, you can actually go into a black and white mode and take some photos. And if we look at these two in black and white, you can see that taking the colors out, you can see those different textures. So we have something ferny, a little lighter, versus the brunnera, which obviously has some great variegation, but is also a very strong leaf texture. So that's just a fun tip for you. Again, these are arbitrary rules. These are things that you can think about, but plant what you want, plant what you love, and go from there. If you're considering adding perennials to the existing landscape, that's generally what we're doing, unless you have a brand new house and you're looking to, start from scratch. But if you are in an existing landscape, you're going to be planting perennials around other plants. So a big tip is to monitor your landscape during the season to see where you can tuck in these perennials. Right now, we're kind of in the doldrums of summer. It is hot. We are tired. The landscape is tired. We're kind of past the peak of ideal blooms before we get into more fall blooms. And so this is a good time to take inventory. What made it? What's not looking great? What might you need to replace? Those kind of things. And here's also a thing. If something doesn't work in one spot, don't just give up on it. I am convinced that I can grow ice plant or the Delosperma. I have tried ice plant many times, many, many times. And so many people say, it's the easiest thing. Why do you struggle with it? I can't answer that. I'm not a great gardener. If it survives in my landscape, I consider that a win. But if you love something and you want it, try it again in that same spot, maybe change your cultural practices or try it somewhere else. Don't necessarily just give up. Look at your landscape from more of a subjective point of view and notice where you could use more color. So if there's kind of a bare spot in the front yard that you notice you have really nice spring color, but not as much in the fall, you need something kind of for that gap late summer, that could be something you can add. And then visit places, go to garden centers, see what's in bloom, see what you love, see what the pollinators are visiting, and just do this many times during the season. I don't think it's hard to convince anyone to go and visit gardens and just see what they might like. And then talk to people, talk to your neighbors, talk to master gardeners, and ask what their favorite plant of the moment is, because that changes depending on the month. And I can tell you what I love right now was different than what I loved in April. So do that as well, because there's always new introductions, new things, plants that are being trialed that could be really great selections for Colorado. So consider all of those as well. And if this, design is hard, that's why we have landscape designers in our realm, because they see this. They have the art side, they have the science side. And so if this is something that you just struggle with, or it's just not something you're interested in doing, there are resources. So Resource Central is a great place because when you buy their garden in a box, they actually give you a map of how to plant those plants together that makes sense, that puts the taller stuff at the back and the smaller stuff in the front. Plant Select is also a great website. So Plant Select has numerous designs available online that you can take advantage of. And if your garden isn't quite as big as 12 by 28, just split this in half. Maybe you do a 12 by 12 and just plant a smaller section of it. That gives you the freedom to really kind of manipulate and plant according to what your landscape looks like. So pre-planned designs are amazing, kind of like color by number, if you will. So it will tell you how many plants you need to buy, but also visit demonstration gardens, visit those botanic gardens and see what they have paired next to each other. And if you like how it looks, you could then replicate that at home. When should you plant? Ideally, right now, well, it's cooler now, but I would say in July, really tough time to plant. It was so hot. So the ideal times are spring when we have more moderate weather and also some more moisture, or as we get later on into the fall. So late August into September, those are going to be more ideal times. Now, you can plant in the summer. No one says you can't. You just need to make sure that you are available to provide irrigation and make sure that you get that plant established. So designing a garden and then planting a garden and then going to Paris for the Olympics for a month, probably not the best approach. Make sure that you are around to take care of that plant. Looking forward, the next few weeks are really ideal times to get new perennials in the ground. We'll meet Thermopsis a little bit later. This is one of my favorites, but so stay tuned for that because it's really a showstopper. If you plant in the spring, a few considerations. So you are ready to go. You are excited. You are energetic, right? You've been idle all winter and you are looking to get those hands in the soil. So everything in terms of plant material is available. Our garden centers are packed with plants. Everything is exciting. You're excited. And so those two things go hand in hand. Also in the spring, with the exception of this year, we tend to have a little bit better soil moisture because we've had some snow over the winter months, and then we tend to get more moisture in the spring as well. So what that means is that digging in our soils is a lot easier, right? Because there's moisture in there. So we're not using the pickaxe to get through our soils when they dry down. Planting in the spring means that plants have several months to get established before the winter. It's generally cooler outside. And then really the rule of thumb is as soon as you're able to dig in your soil, you can plant perennials. So that might be April. It might be May, depending on where you live. If you're higher up in elevation, your spring is a little bit slower to come, so you might need to wait a little bit longer. And then use mulch, and we'll talk about mulch in some way to help retain that soil moisture, helping keep moisture near the plant roots that are starting to establish. If you want to plant in late summer into the fall, these are some considerations. So sales and discounts. We have a pretty large nursery in Fort Collins, and I see that they're going to be having a sale coming up, which is very exciting. The other thing is that our soils in Colorado stay warm well into the fall. So we have Earth's mass to help keep soils warm. So even when the air temperature gets cold, or maybe we have occasional frost, the soil temperature is warm. And that's what's really important for those roots to get going. They need kind of warmer temperatures to put on new growth to get them through the winter months. The problem with fall planting is that selection may not be as great. Plants look a little bedraggled. They might not look as fun. They might not be in bloom. And so you really kind of have to have an open mind and maybe settle for things, or just know what you're looking for and then buy that plant, even if it looks a little tired. But you can spend earlier in the season observing those plants or going to garden centers and seeing what they look like, and then wait until fall to put them in the ground. So what is the final timeline for fall planting? If you're in the mountains, I would say if you're over maybe 6,500 feet, you're looking to get things in the ground by the end of August. So by the end of this month, you still have 2 full weeks plus to get things into the ground, get them watered, and then mulched, and try to get them established before the winter months. If you're in the Front Range into the Plains area, you really have until mid to late September. I wish I could predict what kind of fall we're going to have. If it's a long, leisurely fall, oftentimes we can plant until October in the Front Range. It just depends. We might get really cold weather setting in shortly after Labor Day, and then that kind of sets things back. So just be aware, but really for safety, you can definitely plant in the Front Range through the end of this month. When you're planting, you're going to take the plant out of its pot. It's probably going to be in a black plastic container. And this time of year, more than likely, you're going to have a ton of roots that are on the outside. So you're going to pretty aggressively break up those roots with your hands. You could use a knife or something to score it, but definitely try to break that apart. Going directly from the pot into the ground, those roots may not have the ability to grow outward. And the plant may not get established in time for winter weather. So do kind of be aggressive. Don't kind of be aggressive. Be aggressive and really tear up those root systems. You are not going to hurt the plant. I promise you. This is a really hard thing, especially for beginning gardeners, because you think, oh my gosh, those roots are so sensitive, but you can really tear them apart. And every place where the root tears apart, it's going to branch and form new roots. So that is a really good thing. Then replant the plant where the top of the plant is level with the soil in your yard. So we're looking at the soil level, not the mulch level, and then kind of push soil around it to get it packed into place. And for the most part, we don't need to fertilize at planting. These plants are happy, they're healthy. At the nursery setting, they're getting fertilizer. So adding fertilizer at planting is not recommended unless you get a soil test that indicates otherwise. So planting perennials, this is Beagle Maple. She's one of my beagles. You'll meet Juniper as well. This was part of my landscape that I redid this summer. And really, you don't need to add amendments either. So this is a big thing. Do I need to amend my soil? And what you need to think about is, first of all, if you have older soils, so my house was built in 1989. This area in particular has been in turf for that entire time. I have really good soils in this area. If you have a brand new house with a brand new landscape, they're probably going to add some organic matter. But if you can and you want to, adding organic matter to the entire area is probably more economical than amending each planting hole. And it also depends on what you're planting. Our natives, our more xeric plants, they don't want heavily amended soils. They want things to be more lean. They do need good drainage, and sometimes if we over amend, it doesn't drain as well. So that is the recommendation. So be cautious with using amendments. Again, see what your soils are like. It may not be a necessary thing unless you're starting from a brand new landscape. And then when we're planting, always space your plants accordingly. I know this looks a little gappy, and it does, but these plants are going to grow over time. It takes a couple years for them to really fill in that space. And it's better to plant them too far apart than too close, because then you have to do kind of radical measures to either dig them up or move them or divide them. So in time, this will fill in and it will look completely normal, but up front, it looks a little bit strange. I get that. When we get our plants in the ground, all plants, this is really, really important. All plants will need regular water for that first growing season. If you fall plant or late summer plant, you're going to want to water until the soils freeze. Generally, maybe sometime late October, November. So give them regular water until the soils freeze. And then the next season, make sure that you're giving them regular water as well. So basically 1 year from the time you plant. With spring planted stuff, water them for the entire season, occasionally in the winter, and then by the next spring, they should be pretty darn established. Do watch your watering. It's easy to overwater. And then we do recommend that you use some type of mulch. So squeegee, that might be a word that you've heard of. It is being used as a mulch. It is different than pea gravel. So sometimes there is a recommendation to use a rock type or pea gravel or squeegee, especially around some of the more xeric plants, maybe some of the natives. And squeegee is different than pea gravel. Pea gravel is very round and it tends to be a little more slippery. So it's not a firm walking surface. Squeegee is what's filtered down, and these are kind of the pieces that are smaller. They tend to be more angular and they pack in. So squeegee can also be used as a pathway material, but it's also being used as a mulch. You can decide what you like. I'm using wood mulch in my landscape. I have found that it works for me. It may not be the best solution for you. If you're in a fire-prone area or you're doing more fire-resilient landscaping, wood mulch is not a great choice. So really, when it comes to mulch, we could have an entire session just on mulch, but find something that works for you, that you like. And no matter what you're using, you're going to apply it at a depth of at least 3 inches, if not 4. That includes the squeegee. So 3-inch depth. Wood mulch would be 3 to 4 inch depth. So find a mulch that works, and then you'll have to do weed control because weeds are still going to grow in on the top and not necessarily from the bottom. I will also mention here, because I'm guessing there might be a question, should you use landscape fabric? No, not, there is research on landscape fabric. And first of all, it really doesn't prevent weeds. Second of all, it can actually encumber plant growth because the pores in the landscape fabric clog over time. And so it doesn't allow water to move through. It doesn't allow oxygen into the root system. And so I always say that if you care about the overall health of your plant, avoid the landscape fabric and put whatever mulch you're using directly on top of the soil surface. So landscape fabric, and things slide off. It deteriorates over time. It doesn't really look good. So it works temporarily to control weeds, but it's not a long-term solution for weed control. Looking at overwintering care, again, water them well until the ground freezes. And then for your newly planted stuff, especially if you're kind of pushing it and maybe getting into the ground a little bit later than you had wanted to, then add a thick layer of mulch. So that could be your wood mulch, it could be leaves, it could be grass clipping, anything to kind of protect the crown of the plant. What we want to do is keep the plant in the ground and not heave out because of the freeze thaw. So naturally soils are going to kind of move, they freeze and they push stuff out. So you do want to help control that, and mulch will help moderate some of those soil temperatures. Next spring, as you start to see growth, you can pull that mulch away and do what you need to do. And the biggest thing, remember, plants take time to grow. Perennials, we say they're on a 3-year cycle. So the first year they sleep, they're getting their roots established. The next year they creep, they kind of start to push new growth. And then the third year, year 3, is when they really put on a show. They start to fill in, they have excellent bloom. And so it's a passion of, you need to be patient, right? It's going to be, patience is a virtue in this case, and give them some time to get established. So that's why we're not overplanting when we put the plants in the ground, and we do want them to get established. So I just wanted to share a couple photos of a renovation that I did, and I actually used Garden in a Box, and I bought a kit, and I loved it. The process, if you haven't done it, and this is just not a shameless plug for their organization, it was so easy. I bought the plants online. I live in Windsor, so I got a little bit of a discount from my water provider. Then I picked it up. They actually loaded them into my car. I didn't even have to get out of the car. And I drove home. The whole process to pick them up took all of like 3 minutes. It was amazing. So in my landscape, I had this place behind our shed that we had, and it was just grass. No one used it except for the 2 beagles. And so it was just grass. I was watering it. I didn't love it. It wasn't really useful. And so I decided to kill it off. I used a non-selective herbicide. We're not going to get into that, but I used actually 3 applications of this herbicide to kill things off because I had some persistent weeds. And I started the process in mid-May. That's when I started the process. So every 2 weeks, I applied the herbicide until the grass was good and dead. So on the picture on the left, you can see maple, checking things out. The grass is dead. I scalped it down, so I just used a lawnmower to cut it as short as possible, but I left the grass in place. Okay, so I didn't want to remove the grass because if I remove the grass, I'm removing the best soil that I have in my landscape. So I chose to leave the dead grass in place as a mulch. So it's an organic material, it will break down over time, and I planted into, as you can see on the right, I planted into the dead grass. So juniper is there. If you have a beagle, you know that they're part of every single process that you do. Any dog is going to do this. But they were very, very instrumental in making sure that things were planted properly in my landscape. And then I covered everything with a wood mulch. So that was the choice I used. I could have used something else. The rest of my landscape was wood mulch, so that was just my choice. So I have all of my garden in a box plants in here. I had to buy a few more because it was a bigger space. You can see that I have an existing oak species. I have some irrigation heads, but I was able to cap off 3 heads in this area. So I just have 2 to water it. And that's pretty amazing. So I'm saving a lot of water that way. The lamb's ear, that's a conversation we should have. It's really spread, it's naturalized. I don't love it, but it's something green, so I'm leaving it for now. So this was when I first planted after the mulch went on. This was the end of June. And then this is what it looked like this morning. So things have doubled in size. They're starting to get established. And I'm actually thrilled with how it turned out. It took a while. So it took about, 6 to 8 weeks from beginning to end in order to get it in. But I also eliminated a huge part of the lawn that I wasn't using and didn't need to water. So there's my little success story for you. Now, moving on to perennial maintenance. If you're looking to divide, it really depends on when the plants bloom. So if they bloom in the early spring, you would divide after they bloom. If they bloom in the summer, you're going to divide them early on in the spring. Now, if you make the mistake and you divide at the wrong time, it's fine. The biggest thing is to make sure that you're watering everything to get them reestablished if you're replanting in that same spot. So you don't have to divide anything. I think sometimes people get in this idea that, oh gosh, I have to do something, I have to divide them. But really, it's not necessary, only if they've outgrown their space. Maybe their flowering isn't as great. So iris are kind of that. If you've had iris and they tend to dwindle with their flowers, they might need division. With ornamental grasses, we get those dead centers. That's an indication that you can divide. Or you just want to share your plants. We all have those gardener friends in our lives that love to share plants. And if you go and visit them, you likely come home with multiple starts. A couple spring blooming perennials that you would then divide after bloom later on into the summer. Iris are one, Brunnera, hellebores. These are all ones that bloom early on in the spring. And then after their bloom, you can dig them up and divide them. And then our summer blooming perennials, ideally we would divide these in the spring, just as we're starting to see new growth. This includes coneflower, Shasta daisy, coreopsis or tick seed. So as soon as you start seeing growth, you can actually dig up those plants, divide them, and then replant a section in the same spot. So quickly on the steps to division, again, you're digging up the entire plant. This is that same lamb's ear that you saw along the fence in the renovation photo. This is when it was well behaved. Again, it's out of control. But again, dig up the entire plant, remove any of the dead sections. So this is really important with sometimes salvia, with ornamental grasses, or just if there's a bare spot, you don't want that. And then you're going to remove the dead and then chunk up the sections that are living. And then you can replant one into a existing space and then move the rest of the divisions to a friend's house or elsewhere in your landscape. And then water to get them established. That's the big thing. So you're going to treat them like new plants. So dedicate water to them for at least that first growing season. There we have our happy little lamb's ear. Very, very happy little lamb's ear. When it comes to fall or spring cleanup, it's really up to you. Up to your energy levels, what you like your landscape to look like during the winter months. If you want it nice and tidy, absolutely go ahead and clean things up in the fall. If you want to take a break, you want to relax, you want the birds to find areas to hide or nest, maybe you wait until the spring. Some of our plants are great at collecting snow. So coneflower is a perfect example of a plant that feeds birds during the winter. And then it can provide also some winter interest when snow captures on there. But really, it's up to you. It's completely up to you and depends on how you want to maintain your landscape. There is the recommendation in the spring that you wait a little bit longer to let some of our overwintering native pollinators have time to emerge. That's absolutely okay. So maybe instead of cleaning up things in March or April, you wait until the end of April or May so that they have time to complete their life cycle. But again, it's up to you. Clean up when you have the time and the ability, or when you just can't stand the look of stuff. So there reaches a point for me when the daylilies and iris look so floppy and gross, just lying on the ground, that I can't deal with it anymore. I go and then clean those up, but it's sections. I do it in sections. All right, Ben, I will take some questions now before we move into plant selection. I know there are some.
That sounds great. Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions. Can you see all of those? First one's from Ingrid.
Yes, I will open it up. Okay, Ingrid, so Master Gardener applications are open through August 31st. You will apply through your local county. Go to coloradomastergardener.org and you can get the application. So the next question is, how do you know if a perennial plant is mature enough to be planted in the fall to survive? Okay, so I think you're looking at like establishment, like when do we know if it's established to survive through the fall and winter, perhaps? So it would depend on when you plant. But for the most part, even that first season, if you have a plant that you planted in the spring, it will not hurt things to add some protection with mulch for that first winter. So that is fine depending on when it's planted. I hope that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't. I won't be able to get to all of these. So again, I can type my email into the chat. I'm just gonna pick the ones that I think are most relevant to right now. So I mentioned warm soil. Is there an optimum soil temperature for fall planting? Or if the soil is lower, then don't plant. So I don't think there is an optimum number for our soil temperatures. If the ground is frozen, that wouldn't be optimum. But really now through the end of September is going to be great. Our soils will gradually cool. It's not going to be an instant thing overnight. The big thing is that you want to get the plant in the ground when the soil is still warm to encourage root growth. And you don't want to cut it too short that we go from, cooling soils to frozen soils. So the establishment to get those new roots will probably take a few weeks. So that's what you want to kind of plan for. So there's the planting process, but then there's the establishing and growing new roots for the plant to be able to survive the winter months. So maybe, that's why you need at least 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of warmer soil temperatures to get those new roots established. Okay, let's see. So are pine needles a good mulch for overwintering? Yeah, pine needles are awesome. If you have access to pine needles, they are amazing. What's really nice, because we do get a lot of wind during the winter months, the pine needles kind of act like, pickup sticks, or that game where things knitted together. So they tend to knit together and they don't blow away. They kind of keep in their blob form. So pine needles would be great. Again, chalk leaves would be really awesome. You could use those, and anything that you have, if it's easily available, you could definitely use that. If plants have been eaten by grasshoppers, isn't that the story of our summer this year? Are the roots okay? So our grasshopper pressure really came on a little bit later. We saw some early grasshoppers, but really things got bad when things got hot. So July was horrible for grasshoppers. They're still around. The good news is that perennials are pretty tolerant. This actually goes for all plants, including your trees and shrubs that may have been chewed. So if things got chewed, it is very likely that the plant has enough reserves in the root system to push new growth the following year. So just keep that in mind. However, Leave everything, even if it's just little bits and bobs of the plant, don't cut it back, because even the stems will actually photosynthesize and produce some carbohydrates. Leave everything in place until it turns brown and dormant, then you can remove it, but leave everything. But unless it was a brand new plant and it was struggling, I think everything should return just fine next year. So grasshoppers are the worst. I think we can all agree on that. Okay. Oh my gosh, so many questions. I'm gonna answer one more and then I'm gonna move on again. We can put my email address in there. So let's see. Trying to pick my favorite one. Okay. Diana asked, my perennials seem dead on the lower half of the stem, but still alive and green on the upper half. Why is that? It might be too much water, Diana. So maybe check your irrigation, and sometimes we might get things happening below the plant, especially if things are too moist, or if there's residual water left on the plant that might lead to conditions that are not ideal for the plant. It could also be a sign that maybe things are a little too close to each other. So maybe division is necessary or kind of spacing things out. So it might be an air circulation issue as well. So you can check out some of those things. But okay, so I'm going to move on. Ben, is that okay?
Of course, we'll get to as many questions as we can, but we definitely want to let you get through the presentation.
Yes, and for those of you who had specific questions about what I did in my landscape, please email me and then I can tell you a little bit more. I'm also making a video so I can share that with you, or I'll just tell you the steps that I did. Okay, so let's now move on to plants because this is the fun part. This is the part where you can get inspiration, you can go shopping, you can get ideas of what might work in your landscape. And so one program I want to call your attention to is the Plant Select program. This is a cooperative program between CSU, the Denver Botanic Gardens, and the Green Industries of Colorado. These three entities came together over 20 years ago, I think it's 25 years ago, and they decided that because Colorado is a tough place to garden, they wanted to start a plant introduction program of plants that do well in the semi-arid West. So this includes Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, a little bit down into Arizona, New Mexico. But these are plants that are lower water, that have a lot of great ornamental benefits. And they didn't limit the program to just natives or introduced ornamentals. So it's a combination of both. Plus it includes nativars, which is a kind of a newer word. So nativars is a native plant, but there's been selections to introduce as cultivars into the plant trade. So these are plants that have been trialed, they've been researched. There's demonstration gardens and research gardens across Colorado, and people plant these and then they take data and they offer recommendations. So the plants that Plant Select introduces are really the best of the best. These have done well in most garden locations. They're going to do well for most gardeners, and it includes a variety of perennials and then some trees and shrubs as well. The website is plantselect.org, and you can just type that into your search browser and find it. So these, again, are really good choices. I will note that only independent garden centers will have Plant Select plants. They aren't available at box stores or hardware stores, and so you'll need to go to an independent garden center to find these. Perennials for all places. So let's talk about, I broke it up into 3 different sections. I do want to mention light. So light is a big thing, and when we move to Colorado, or if you've lived here your entire life, you know that the light intensity in Colorado is very different than if you're from Minnesota, which is where I grew up. So Colorado has a ton of sunny days. We have a lot of high intensity UV light. And it's different when you're at a higher elevation and the intensity of the light that your plant gets. So full sun in Colorado is very different and far more intense than full sun in Minnesota or Ohio or anywhere else, just because of the elevation that we're dealing with. You're higher up in the mountains, you know that 8,000 feet in full sun is very different, and we can see some burning that occurs. So when I talk about plants and I talk about their light requirements, when I'm talking about full sun, we're really referring to anything that gets more than 6 hours of direct summer sun per day. So summer sun is different than winter sun because the sun is higher, but anything more than 6 hours. Going down into partial shade, we're looking at like 2 hours of direct sun, so maybe late morning sun, and then shaded the rest of the day. So this could be maybe on the north side of the house or maybe on the west house, but there's a tree that's blocking the sun later on in the afternoon. And then when we have deep shade, this means that there's no direct sun or no indirect light actually reaching the ground. So deep shade would be underneath a spruce tree or on the north side of the house in the corner where it never sees the light of day. Okay, that's what deep shade is. Deep shade is so hard to grow anything. So generally we're looking at full sun down to full shade, where we do get a little bit of light penetration, light duration, but not necessarily ideal. So that is an important thing to think about, depending on where you're planning on planting. And a lot of our xeric plants tend to be full sun plants. You might live in a landscape that's 30 years old and you have a bunch of mature trees and you have too much shade. So looking at xeric plants or natives, you might need to start looking beyond some of those because it's just hard to grow those plants when it's too shady. So you'll have to make adjustments. And that's the great thing about landscaping is that it's a really slow performing art, and things change over time. So for those of you in newer builds, you have a very different location, very different light exposure than you will in 20 years or 30 years from now. All right, so our first category is the best of Plant Select. So I just talked about this program, plantselect.org, and this is a totally biased selection based on what I think does well. So I have mentioned that I'm not a great gardener. I don't have any sort of irrigation in my landscape beds. I have turf irrigation, but beyond that, all of my landscape beds are fend for yourself, get what Mother Nature gives you, or hand watering, which I do very, very sparingly because I'm kind of a spendthrift when it comes to water. So these are plants that I have used in my own landscape and they tend to do really well. So let's take a look at some of those. The first is incredible. This is golden candles. So you saw it a few slides ago in the beginning of my presentation, and I cannot say enough good things about this plant. This is one that was introduced by Plant Select back in 2020, and it kind of went unnoticed. I thought it should have received a lot more accolades than it did, because when this plant is in full bloom, the entire plant is covered in these beautiful golden yellow flowers. It blooms very early. So in my landscape, it bloomed at the end of April and it had blooms well into June. I want to say at least mid-June, if not late June. And so it's an early spring plant. Right now it looks terrible. It doesn't like the heat, so it's kind of declined. But for the show it gave me early on in the spring, this is at the top of my list as one of my favorites. Great for pollinators, which is really important, and super cold hardy. So for those of you who live at a higher elevation, this one would work more than likely for you. So it's what we call in horticulture, it's a showstopper. It's a 50-mile-an-hour plant where you're driving down the road at 50 miles an hour and you see it out of the corner of your eye and you're like, what is that? This is that kind of plant. It's pretty incredible. So a couple more photos. There's Juniper for you. She's not a fan of the photos. She's very uncomfortable, but she's a smaller beagle, but you can see how this plant, it was at least 24 inches tall and then about 24 inches wide. It held its form, it held the blooms, and again, just a phenomenal plant. This is Golden Candles. It's very, very similar to the false indigo. If you have that, I think it's like a cousin of it. So it looks similar, but it blooms much earlier than the false indigo does. So top of my list is one of my favorites. Next is penstemon. The great thing about penstemon is that there's so many different types and they're small, they're ground covers, they're tall, there's flowers that are in many different colors of the rainbow. and penstemon is great. There's also a ton of native penstemon, which is really nice, so you can make those selections. There's a lot of varieties out there. Be sure to buy one that's hardy for Colorado, because there are some annual penstemon or ones that are native to maybe Texas or Oklahoma that are not going to overwinter here. So research is really key when it comes to penstemon. These are deer resistant, they attract hummingbirds and bees, so really awesome pollinator plant. And they have those tubular flowers. The nice thing is you could plant several penstemon in an area and have really good continuous bloom. A couple that I have found to be just phenomenal, Carolyn's Hope. This is actually a plant that supports breast cancer research. So the person who introduced this plant, his wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, and so a portion of this plant's proceeds actually go to breast cancer research. But the flower is that breast cancer pink, which is really beautiful. It tends to bloom in June and into July, so it has a fairly long season of bloom. Only about 18 inches tall, and it's very petite. It doesn't take up space, it doesn't spread, it just holds its own, and it's really a phenomenal plant. And the bees love it. They get stuck in the flowers. It's so cute to try to get them to wiggle out, but really a wonderful plant. Another one, and this was introduced by Plant Select way back in 1999, 25 years ago, is Pike's Peak Purple. Another wonderful Plant Select plant, about the same height, 14 to 18 inches tall, but a purple color, and just really a phenomenal plant. The penstemons, I think, have a place in everyone's Colorado landscape. So look at those, look at the different types. There's pine leaf penstemon, which has a really finely, like a fine leaf foliage, which is really cool, and then orange blooms. So lots of different variation, and you can find one that you like. Silver Heels Horehound, this is a new one to me, and I really like it because I like the texture of the leaves, and I think I'm personally looking for something to replace the lamb's ear that is in my landscape. So this is a ground cover. It's a matte forming ground cover that is only 4 inches tall, but gets to be about 30 inches wide. And it has this beautiful gray silver fuzzy foliage year round. It is awesome. When it gets a little bit of water on it or dew, it actually almost sparkles. Beautiful. This is a native to Turkey. And you might think, wow, how does Turkey have a similar climate? But we're really looking at the portions of Turkey that are hot and dry, but also with some cold hardiness as well. It has a white flower. If you don't love it, you can remove it. It might be distracting from the foliage. A big thing with this one is it really doesn't like poorly drained sites. This is not one to site under the gutter or the downspout or a low spot in the landscape. Make sure that it does have a well-drained soil, and it is also deer resistant, which is nice. So there is the dew or the irrigation on the foliage. I think it's phenomenal. It's just beautiful. You can see it here in the top right in more of a rock garden setting, so kind of almost cascading down a little bit of a slope. And then the bottom right are the flowers. Love them, hate them, you can remove them. Don't feel like you need to commit to having the flowers in the landscape, but just a really, really cool texture, really finely textured plant. Moon carrot, I went bonkers over a couple weeks ago. We had our annual trial evaluation days up at CSU at the trial gardens, and moon carrot was having its moment. It was amazing. This is such an unusual plant, and it's just cool. It's just something that's it's a conversation piece for your landscape. So it has this blue, lacy, carrot-like foliage. So if you can kind of envision what the carrot foliage looks like, this is a little more blue, but very, very similar to what carrot foliage looks like. And then it has these enormous umbel flowers, which you can see here, these umbel flowers that then have these smaller flowers that make up the entire bloom. Full sun, drought tolerant, and the pollinators on this were going crazy. Lots of native bees. It had some honeybees on there as well. It's just a really interesting plant. The height is about 36 inches tall, 20 inches wide. So, and it looks like it should flop over because the heads of the flowers are just so big, but it does retain that. So here's another look at what that looks like. That blue-green foliage, really attractive in the early spring before it blooms. And then it has these really phenomenal flowers, which is super cool. Love it. One of the grasses that was introduced from Plant Select is Standing Ovation Little Blue Stem. So Little Blue Stem is a native to Colorado. Standing Ovation is an introduced ornamental, an introduced cultivar, and it was selected because it has really awesome fall color. So it's a warm season grass. What that means is it takes a little bit longer in the spring to warm up, to green up. So it will start growing in June. Does really well in poor, dry soils, and it keeps a tight habit. So I think sometimes our ornamental grasses may flop over or they lodge or they don't retain that nice tight habit that we want. And Little Blue Stem, especially Standing Ovation, you can kind of get the idea that it's standing upright, really does a good job of retaining that height and that form throughout the entire season. And there are multiple cultivars, so I'll introduce you to Standing Ovation itself. What's great is that it's more of a bluish green during the summer months, and then as the temperatures drop, as we get less daylight, the anthocyanins, which are the reds in our leaf color, they actually start to express themselves. So instead of always looking to maybe trees and shrubs for giving us fall color, I think we could look to some of our perennials like Standing Ovation and some of the other grasses. There's another one I'll introduce you to. But they're really nice for fall color. If you're up in the Fort Collins, Loveland area, over at Centera, which is on the east side of I-25, they have planted a ton of blue grama, and you can see the really nice fall color in those plants, which is great. So this was introduced by Plant Select in 2018. Another one that's not a Plant Select introduction, but still deserves a nod is called Blaze Little Blue Stem. This is one of my favorite pictures ever because this little orange tabby looks amazing with this Blaze Little Blue Stem behind it. So Standing Ovation is a little more red and Blaze is going to be more hints of orange, but still a phenomenal plant. Really, really, really incredible. Moving into perennials for dry shade, these are the areas that really are difficult to garden in. So it could be that your landscape is a little more shaded because of trees, or maybe you're trying to landscape below trees. But these are areas, and what I mean by dry shade, so they're areas that don't get regular sunlight, and they're also areas that wouldn't receive regular irrigation. So this may mean that you don't have irrigation heads, or maybe you're only letting Mother Nature and precipitation get to these areas, but you are not actually providing regular irrigation to these spots. If you have shade, but you have irrigation, you have far more plants that you could consider because there's a lot of plants that do well in shade and more moist conditions, but these are ones that really can take it more dry. The first is hellebores, and you've seen hellebores a few times in my slides. These are also called Lenten roses, and they're called that because they actually bloom around Lent each year, so very, very early in the spring. There are years when we see them blooming even at the end of January, especially if it's a really mild winter, but especially into February and then maybe early March. So these, along with some of our fall planted bulbs, are one of the earliest things to bloom, and they're great. So they are giving some good pollen and nectar to our overwintering bees that are out and about, but they also give us gardeners hope that spring is on its way as well. So this plant does best in full to partial shade, only about 2 by 2. What I love about the hellebores is that the colors are very muted. So it's not bright, raucous, in your face. It's kind of like a, hey, I'm here for spring, but I'm not quite ready to be showy like some of the other plants that you might get. So a lot more muted colors, but still very, very beautiful. And they bloom on the moisture that we get in the fall and the winter, which is really, really nice. So again, bloom early. You can get blooms all the way into May. There are different cultivars that you could consider planting, so you get kind of a sequence of blooms. And they really do need that well-drained soil as well. So not a heavy, again, not a low spot plant, not a gutter, under the gutter plant. These really preferred well-drained soils and more of the dry shade. One cultivar I'll bring your attention to is winter bells. For several years up at CSU, the perennial trials, they call them the 3-year perennial trials because they're in the ground for 2 winters and then 3 growing seasons. This hellebore has done remarkably well. So they've had multiple hellebores in the trials, and winter bells has consistently done really well. It is in fairly shaded conditions. So it's on the west side of a building, but it is completely shaded by some evergreens and other taller plants. And you can see that it's just beautiful. So kind of a creamy white pink. They're not tall plants, so they're not really, really noticeable, but they deserve respect just because they bloom so early in the spring. The Siberian bugloss, or Brunnera, as it's most often called, this is a ground cover plant, great for part to full shade, will do really well. And there's been a ton of propagation and production into Brunnera. So this one, the plain old Brunnera, as I'll call it, was what we had available for so many years, just green leaves. But I will say these beautiful periwinkle blue flowers are phenomenal. We don't have enough blue plants in our lives. So the blue flowers kind of dance on top of the foliage. They bloom very early in the spring, so the foliage will emerge and then the flower stalks, and then we'll get several weeks of bloom. And all of the flowers tend to be shades of this blue, light blue, maybe even a little bit white. Really a hardy plant, like hardy to zone 3, can take a lot of conditions. It will take higher levels of moisture if you have it, but it will also do well in this dry shade condition. A couple cultivars, Jack Frost is really nice. There's a lot of white to the leaf, so more of that silvery green as opposed to just the plain green. And then I believe Alchemy Silver, hopefully this one makes you ooh and ah. This is one that also did well in the CSU perennial trials. In this case, when we see it with the blooms, I feel like the blooms are almost distracting. They're cool, they're great, they're blue, but that leaf and the variegation in that leaf is just awesome. It looks like it's almost painted with silver paint. Just really, really show-stopping. And if you can think of where you would use this in a dry shade place that maybe is a little bit darker, think of how much that would make that area pop with just that silvery color and that white color. It would be fantastic. So Alchemy Silver is one of the greatest Brunnera cultivars that's been introduced. An ornamental grass for dry shade are the dwarf blue fescues. So in terms of turf, our fescues tend to be a little bit more shade tolerant than other species. The dwarf blue fescues are ornamental grasses. They are little cute mop tops of blue, shades of blue. So some are very blue. This is Elijah blue, so this one's actually pretty blue in color. Some of them might be more green. They have one called sea urchin, and you can kind of get an idea of what it is. So a lot of them are very small, only about 6 to 8 inches tall. What I have noticed about the dwarf blue fescues is that rabbits do like them. I have found them to be chewed by rabbits. They lose a section, so usually the rabbits will chew part of it and leave part of it. So if you do have rabbit pressure, maybe find a way to fence these off, cage them off, or at least protect them until they're fully established and can take some of that feeding. And the other problem is they tend to die out in the center. So the edges will stay in foliage and then the center will die out, and you kind of need to make that decision of division or maybe just replacement. But planted as a group, they are wonderful. It really adds a lot of interest. It adds a lot of texture to an area. And again, they're small, so they'd be perfect along sidewalks or paths. Obviously, only 6 to 8 inches tall. You want to keep them front and center so that you can really enjoy them the most. And then a ground cover to consider: bugleweed or ajuga. If you grew up in the Midwest or came from the Midwest, this is probably a weed that you might turn your nose up at, just because it's a little more weedy there than it is in Colorado. And it really comes down to how much water you provide this plant. Again, dry shade is what we're emphasizing here, so not a lot of supplemental, if any, water. But if you were to put this in a space that gets a lot of water, you will have a big mat of bugleweed. So there is your warning right there, because it spreads by stolons, which are above ground roots, and so will creep along the plant's surface. So if it has moisture, it will take advantage of the moisture. But if it's drier, it's going to stay far more contained. Only about 6 inches tall spreads up to maybe 12 to 15 inches. So if you want to kind of form a larger space, you'll need several plants. And then it does have bluish flowers in the spring. A couple cultivars. One is chocolate chip. First of all, I love the name. It's amazing. Second of all, we have like a really good variegation. So we have kind of a darker maroon leaf paired with a lighter green leaf. So we're getting that contrast of dark and light, which is really nice. And then burgundy glow. You can decide if you like this. It kind of looks like it's more muted, almost looks like it might be covered in like powdery mildew, but I think it looks better in person than it photographed. But again, kind of some interesting variegation there. So that's bugleweed, really nice ground cover. So if you're just looking for plants to kind of creep along the ground or take up space, so that it helps even more reduce weed pressure, bugleweed could be a really nice spot for those dry shade spots. And then the last group of plants we'll have are those that love it hot and dry. These are your full blazing sun, 6+ hours of sun, that will do well in most landscapes and are also going to be pretty xeric and drought tolerant as well. The first is platinum sage. This actually is a plant select introduction, and it's more of a kind of a ground cover / smaller perennial. It has really beautiful kind of silvery white foliage, so another good one if you are looking to replace some of the lamb's ear. But again, kind of that silvery foliage, but the flowers are spectacular. You can see how prolific the flowers are on this plant. Lots and lots and lots of flowers, very floriferous. Only 8 to 12 inches tall with the flowers, so you're going to want to bring it closer to your paths or closer to the front of your perennial border. And if you remove the flowers and go and cut this back, you are likely to get a second set of blooms later on in the summer, which is really, really nice. So you can get extended weeks of blooms. Deer resistant, what more could we want in a plant? And I will say salvia, which is the genus of this species, salvia is a huge group of plants, and there's both ornamental salvia, and then there's edible or culinary salvia, same plant, the sages you might be familiar with. So salvia is a big group of plants, and all of the salvias in general are going to do very well. They're going to be drought tolerant. They're going to have great blooms. So good additions to the garden. There's a wide range of plants that you could consider. A couple more shots. You can see those flowers on there, great for pollinators. And you can see it planted in the accent with the yellow and purple, which is a really, really nice combination. The sedums and stone crops, this is another really huge group of plants. Sedums can be ground covers, they can be taller ornamentals, and these are part of the succulents group. So succulents are still very, very popular, and I think Colorado Gardens are a great place to have a showcase of some of our succulent plants. They'll combine well with cacti. If you're growing any cacti or yucca, or the hesperaloe, all of those will pair really well. They're going to have this similar or same water use, which is nice. A lot of the sedums are going to tolerate rocky or poor soils. They do prefer it to be more well-drained, so keep that in mind. But again, wide range of flower colors, wide range of foliage colors, and the flowers are attracted to pollinators, which is nice. I don't love the flowers on some of the ground covers. Again, they kind of sit above, and I think that the foliage is more interesting, but again, that is up to you. And they do tend to be deer resistant. With your sedum, water to let them get established and then just let them do their thing. They don't need a lot of supplemental attention or moisture, and overwatering can usually be worse for the plant than underwatering. So let them go once established. And a few have absolutely spectacular flower blooms. This is Autumn Joy sedum. This is one of the taller ones, so it's about knee-high at maturity. And these bloom in late summer. I just looked at some of the plants I have today. Right now they're green, but they have formed the flowers, but they will actually color up and bloom late into August and into September. Then they also retain through the winter months, so they give a really interesting texture to the garden, which is awesome. This is a great late season pollinator plant. The bees love this, and they will be so happy if you provide them with some nectar later on in the summer months. You can do this with hypertufas or rock gardens. So this is just one of the ground cover sedums that has overwintered in this rock hypertufa for years in my garden, and it has done extremely well. A plant select introduction sedum is turquoise tails. This one is phenomenal. So it has this really interesting bluish green color with really tight, compact foliage. This is a ground cover introduced many years ago, almost over 10 years ago. And then you can see how the ground cover sedums tend to flower. So the flowers will extend above the canopy of the plant. And again, they do attract pollinators, but you can decide if you like them or just remove them. That is completely up to you. But turquoise tails, really interesting. It's almost like some of the ocean plants or ocean, what am I trying to think of? Like the coral reefs. It almost is like that texture. So it really provides some interesting structure, especially in a rock garden. You can see that we have this agave behind it, which is really cool. Another ground cover sedum that gets really amazing fall color is called Winter Fire. This was introduced by Plant Select just a couple of years ago. And this is the easiest plant to grow, to propagate. And when you buy a plant that might be in a 1-gallon container or even a 4-inch container, something like this you could cut in half and get 2 pieces. For larger plants, you could cut it in multiple sections and then replant all of that. So again, think of that. You can divide up front and get numerous plants. The reason why we plant Winter Fire is because of the fall color. There is a cousin of this plant called Angelina sedum, and it's lime green in the summer, and then it turns kind of an orangey russet during the fall months. Winter Fire is more of a green, and then it turns this really nice burgundy during the fall. It is phenomenal. Again, look to some of these plants to add a little bit more interest to your late summer garden, your fall garden, with some of the colors that they can provide. And then here's Autumn Fire. You met Autumn Morn. Was that the first one? This is Autumn Fire. This is another one that blooms later, also very a little bit taller, about knee-high or so. Related to the sedums are another succulent. These are the hens and chicks. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the hens and chicks, but did you know there's a whole line of hens and chicks called chick charms? And they are amazing. They have really interesting texture, foliage, colors, and they have the best name. So this one is Sugar Shimmer. Who doesn't want Sugar Shimmer in their landscape? Cinnamon Starburst, Berry Bomb. There's an Apple Teeny that's more of like kind of an apple green color with the tips that are a little bit red. So hens and chicks in general are going to do really well in any garden. They're a ground cover. They get that really weird bloom that comes up that you can just cut off. But again, there's a lot of variation. And so if you haven't given a glance to hens and chicks in a while, but you have a tough, dry spot, could be a really good choice. So check out some of the hens and chicks. Another plant that gets great fall color is the hardy plumbago. This one's full sun, but can actually step into part shade. So kind of a transition plant, but does well, very, very adaptable to either full sun or part shade. Another ground cover with those amazing periwinkle blue flowers. So we have vinca, which I didn't talk about. We have the brunnera, and then we have this hardy plumbago. This one actually blooms later on in the summer, so we can kind of pair it with some of those earlier spring blooming ones. This one's a little bit later into the summer, and it really starts putting on a show when the rest of the garden is getting tired and not performing as well. So hardy plumbago could be a really phenomenal plant. And then it turns red in the fall, which is fantastic. So we still see a titch of those blooms. You can see kind of remnants of the blooms, but the foliage will turn red. So like the winter fire sedum, if you pair this with some of the little blue stem, you could get a really nice show of color on more of the reddish side of things. So hardy plumbago, very old, very common plant, but I think does really well in Colorado conditions. Lavender, which is of course what you've been looking at all day behind me. This is a great plant for Colorado, prefers full sun, doesn't like those heavily amended soils. Lavender is a native to the Mediterranean region, and it does phenomenal in Colorado. If you were to plant lavender, the rule of thumb is to try to get it in the spring so it has an entire season to get established. If you plant it in the fall, just be sure to give it some extra protection with mulch before cold weather sets in. In terms of lavender species, the English lavenders are going to be the most hardy. They are going to be hardy to zone 5. So if you're out of zone 5, most of the Front Range is 5, going east is 5, going further into the foothills. Lavender, you could try it and see how it does, or give it a very protected location. It will bloom twice in one season if you cut it back after it flowers. And then in terms of cultivars, I always say that if the name sounds English, it probably is an English type lavender. So Hidcote, Munstead, Mitcham Gray, very English sounding names. The English lavenders are going to be the most hardy. There is one that's a dwarf miniature introduced by Plant Select back in 2017 called Wee One, only 12 inches tall. It's an English type lavender, and it is perfect for rock gardens, for crevice gardens. You can see it planted here, basically squatting on a rock, which is amazing, but really acute. And in terms of pollinators, the lavender is phenomenal, right? Pollinators love it. And also plant lavender where you can walk by and kind of brush against it or touch it, especially if you like that smell. It's so easy to just reach down and then, get the wonderful scent of lavender on your fingers. Coneflower is my next one. Coneflower is very easy to grow. I would also say that it is also very easy to reseed in your landscape. So if you plant coneflower, likely you're going to have seeds that spread and then new plants coming up. You may love this, you may not like it. Really easy to control them by just digging them out. So when you start to see them germinate, you can just remove them or let them grow. Completely up to you. Great for pollinators, really interesting winter texture because the snow will collect on the top of the plant and provide some texture, plus really great for birds with some of the seed during those winter months where it might be hard for them to forage for seed. Can get pretty tall, so heights up to 4 feet. I've noticed in parts of my landscape that might get a little bit of lawn irrigation, the coneflower is much taller than in areas that doesn't receive any water. So up to 4 feet with some regular irrigation. Really wonderful as cut flowers. They're deer resistant, they're rabbit resistant, and there are some really interesting cultivars. One that did really well in the CSU perennial trials is it's a series, it's called Kismet. So Kismet is the series, and then this one was raspberry as the color. And you can see how incredibly uniform these flowers are. So really tall above the foliage. The foliage was nice and green, but those flowers stretch tall. So if you are looking for a nice cut flower from the garden, coneflowers fit the bill. And you could look at this Kismet series as some potentials, plus that kind of magenta raspberry, it's like a raspberry color, raspberry red, looks really, really nice. So you can contrast this with the straight species coneflower. You could add a little bit of yellow with the black-eyed Susans, and those are natural pairings. And then just a couple of grasses to mention. Switchgrass is a phenomenal grass because I think I really like the blooms on it. So I think they look like fireworks. They emerge and they kind of like burst above the foliage on there. These are also really nice because they maintain their shape and form. They can get up to 5 feet tall, which is really nice. And some of the selections have really nice fall color. So let's introduce some of those. The one thing about switchgrass is, and this is something that we see with some ornamental grasses, I mentioned this, is that they don't maintain their form. So they tip over if we get wind or a heavy wet snow, they get smushed and then they don't recover. And the nice thing about ornamental grasses is that we leave them standing during the winter months for interest. And then we cut them back in the spring. So switchgrass in general has a really nice, dense, upright form, and then they can have fall color of yellow or red. Northwind was introduced by the University of Minnesota. They have done a number of introductions and some really good breeding into the ornamental grass. So Northwind, really, really columnar grass. You can see how cool it is. So we have this chain link fence, or a cyclone fence, as I grew up knowing it. We have this chain link fence behind there, and then we planted these ornamental grasses along it, and that just really helps mask some of that metal, but also provides like a living fence, which is really nice. And again, it will maintain that columnar form. So usually 4 to 5 feet tall for most of these grasses. And then the blooms kind of erupt above the foliage. Shenandoah is one that actually gets amazing red fall color. It will start in the top of the plant as the conditions start to change. So nights get longer and the days get cooler and the light gets less. So we start to get some of those expressions of red. And so again, fall color for this is just great. We have some remnants of the coneflower that are planted near it, and it's a nice pairing there. So look for some of the switch grasses along with the little blue stem that can give you some of that fall color. That was my last plant. I know we have 4 minutes left, and I did tell Ben that I can stay after and answer some questions. I do want to thank you for joining me today. My email address is there. Feel free to please reach out to me. I know that there was a lot of you on and a lot of questions I wasn't able to get to, so feel free to reach out to me or your local extension office and Master Gardeners. We can help you. I also want to say that yes, this was recorded. Yes, it will be sent to you. And then Extension has a number of webinars as well. If you go to planttalkcolorado.org/webinars, you can actually see a list of webinars that are upcoming from Extension, and then ones that we've recorded this year. There's a number of topics. So you can check those out. And then Extension in general has a ton of resources and information. So I'll take a few questions, but Ben, do you have any parting comments for our guests tonight?
I do. But yeah, thank you so much, Allison. This was such an interesting presentation, and there's definitely a lot of interest in the topic. So yeah, I just want to say thank you to you again, and thank you to our attendees, and thank you to the City of Golden for sponsoring tonight's webinar. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to do this, so we're very grateful for their support. This our seminar series for this year is almost complete. We've just got 2 seminars remaining this month, and then we're done. So if you're interested in those, please make sure to register on our website. And then when you exit the webinar tonight, you'll see a survey link pop up. If you have the time to fill it out, we'd really value your feedback. We'd like to know how we did and how we can improve this program. Again, the recording will be sent to you at the end of today or tomorrow in the follow-up email. We'll have Allison's slide in there as well. And if you have any other questions or questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to reach out either to Allison or to our team at gardeninfo@resourcecentral.org.
Great, thanks, Ben. I'll just take a few questions here. Hopefully you can find them in the list. There is a question from Robin about solarizing, doing that technique instead of using herbicides to kill off a lawn. Solarizing is great, and the question was, they suggested to take the plastic off and then rake the dead grass away. You would. So if you solarized your regular grass with the height that it was, you will want to remove some of that material. So you could rake it, you could use a lawnmower to cut it down, but you can still leave the stubble in place. So don't think that you necessarily have to remove the total sod unless you want to do that. You can absolutely do that as well. But yeah, you'll want to remove as much of the dead grass as possible before you take the next step to plant. Hopefully that answers that question. A question about the golden candles, does it spread by rhizomes? Not to my knowledge, really a clump former. It does expand and get wider, but I have not noticed, nor did I see in the trials at CSU any sort of creep via those underground roots. So that one should be fine. Let's see. Catherine asks, I've not been able to find moon carrot. Where have you seen it? Honestly, I'm kind of spoiled and I'm fortunate to have some connections because I'm in the industry. I hate to say this because it, makes me sound really entitled. What you can do is on the Plant Select website, there's actually a place where they list their plant dealers. And you can go to that website and see who sells plants and then look for the ones that are local to you in your area. Maybe give them a call so you don't have to go and drive there or hunt them down, but just give them a call to see if they have it in stock now or if they're planning on bringing it in next spring. That's a big thing. I think it's a popular plant, so I would guess like as soon as it arrives, it probably goes out the door. So that would be a big thing. Let's see, what else?
Super quickly for anybody who missed it, I actually shared the link for Plant Select, plantselect.org/where to buy retailers. And you can find that link in the chat, and that'll take you to the list of retailers.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Thank you for posting that. Christine asked, when you cut back lavender, do you just cut off the blooms or go into the foliage? The blooms just died. I was going to cut off the blooms. Yeah, you would just go right below where the blooms kind of stop. If you trim some of the top of the foliage, that's totally fine. But you're really focusing on just removing those blooms. You could go in and remove each bloom individually if you want to take the time to do that. I'm a gardener of efficiency, so I would just probably grab all the blooms and then make one cut. And then you can hopefully get a second set. Might be a little late right now to get a second set of blooms, but give it a try and see what happens. So there was another question about the golden candles. I know I'm telling you, it's amazing. So water and light requirements. So honestly, I only watered to get it established because it blooms so early. It is using water from winter snows and any sort of fall precipitation we get in order to push blooms for that year. Then as it gets hot and dry, it really starts to fade out. So it's very similar to maybe the bleeding heart or some of our poppies that bloom early and then they tend to like just kind of fade with some of the heat. In terms of light requirement, full sun. Full blazing sun, and it will do best. Kathy asks, how fast does horehound spread? Depends on how much you water, Kathy. So if you give it more water, it's going to grow a little bit more quickly. But if you are sparing with your water after establishment, it's going to grow at just a moderate pace. I haven't found it to be invasive by any stretch, not like some of the other plants that look a little bit more like it. Let's see. I don't know, Ben, are there any that you want to add or ask?
I think we covered a lot. We got a lot of questions. If there's anything else you want to answer, we can, but we certainly want to be respectful of your time. And, we know that any attendees can reach out to us later with any of these questions.
Yeah, there's something about planting seeds. That's a long question. So Kathy, you might send me an email. For wildflowers specifically, some do best planted in the fall, some do best planted in the spring. So a lot comes down to the specific plant that you're trying to do. Just depends on if they need a stratification period with that cold temperature. So doing some research and figuring out how the plant is going to grow best from seed will be probably the best option. So with that, I'll just end there. Again, I'll add my emails on the screen. Feel free to reach out. And again, thanks to Resource Central. Thank you, City of Golden. And it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Allison. We had so much fun seeing your presentation today, so we really appreciate it. And everyone, thank you so much for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your night, and thank you for your support. We really appreciate it.